Before we begin this thrilling and engaging radio broadcast, we have a small request. Please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the Voicecast for more captivating broadcasts like this one. And while you're here, tell us in the comments, what are you doing right now? Where are you from? And what time are you watching this? We'd love to hear from you. Now, get comfortable, relax, and prepare yourself as we dive into tonight's chilling journey. Let's begin. This is Coast Guard Command, broadcasting on all emergency channels. We have received a distress call from the private vessel, the Elysium, anchored in international waters at coordinates 32 degrees, 17 minutes north, 64 degrees, 50 minutes west. The audio was disturbing. Sounds of chaos. Screaming, banging, and what can only be described as growling. The static grows louder, almost drowning out the speaker. Our initial attempts to reestablish contact have failed. We urge all vessels to avoid this zone. This is not... Wait, what was that sound? There's a distant clatter, followed by muffled screams and inhuman growls, growing louder before the transmission abruptly cuts to silence. Far from the chaos hinted at by the broadcast, the Elysium floats undisturbed in the moonlit waters, a glimmering beacon of wealth and exclusivity. The scent of fine champagne and gourmet hors d'oeuvres wafts through the air as laughter and music fill the elegant ballroom. Celebrities, business moguls, and influencers toast their success, their oblivious revelry, a stark contrast to the storm brewing below deck. Near the bow of the ship, 2 crew members stand watch. "Did you hear about the cargo we picked up at the last port?" One whispers, glancing nervously toward the lower decks. "I heard it wasn't properly inspected." The other shrugs, brushing off the unease. "It's probably just another crate of exotic goods. Don't worry about it." But deep in the cargo hold, faint, guttural noises stir, too quiet to be heard over the festivities. Back in the ballroom, the yacht's owner, a charismatic entrepreneur, raises his glass to the good life and to the freedom of the open sea. His toast is met with enthusiastic applause, his guests blissfully unaware that their isolation is about to become their greatest enemy. Without warning, the lights flicker and die. The music stops abruptly, replaced by the uneasy murmurs of the guests. "What happened?" someone asks, their voice trembling. A crew member's voice crackles through the ship's intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've experienced a minor power outage. Please remain calm while we work to resolve the issue." But calm is the last thing anyone feels. The yacht's once vibrant energy is replaced by an oppressive silence, broken only by faint, unfamiliar sounds. A distant thud, a low growl. Then, something metallic clangs loudly from below deck, followed by hurried footsteps echoing in the darkness. Panic spreads like wildfire as whispers turn into fearful chatter. The uneasy crowd gathers on the main deck, clutching their phones and wine glasses. A sudden commotion near the stairwell sends a ripple of alarm through the group. A crew member stumbles into view, their uniform soaked in blood. Gasps echo as the crowd recoils in horror. "Help them!" someone shouts, but the crew member collapses to their knees, clutching their chest. Their voice is barely audible over the rising panic. "They're here. Who's here?" the yacht's owner demands, stepping forward. But the crew member's lifeless body slumps to the floor. Before anyone can process the horror, a guttural roar erupts from the staircase. The crowd turns as a grotesque, disfigured figure emerges, its milky eyes locking onto the terrified guests. Chaos erupts. Guests scream and scatter as the creature lunges forward, its inhuman growls cutting through the panic. The opulent isolation of the Elysium has turned into a nightmarish trap. The survivors are thrust into a desperate fight for survival as the true nature of their nightmare unfolds. Humanity has always sought to push the boundaries of what is possible, but ambition often comes at a cost. In laboratories hidden from the public eye, scientists work tirelessly to create a revolutionary virus, one designed to enhance human capabilities. They called it Project Ascension, a cure for disease, a pathway to limitless strength and endurance, they said. But in their quest to perfect humanity, they unleashed a force that defied control. The virus mutated rapidly, its effects unpredictable and violent. Initial tests showed promise until patients began displaying uncontrollable aggression, heightened strength, and an insatiable hunger. The mutation took an even darker turn. Airborne strains were detected, capable of infecting anyone exposed. What began as a miracle became a nightmare, a ticking time bomb that no one was prepared to stop. And so the world stood on the brink, unaware that the first domino had already fallen. At first, the outbreaks were small. A rural hospital in Eastern Europe reported patients attacking staff and other patients. In South America, a cargo ship's crew was found mutilated, their bodies barely human. Governments acted quickly to contain these incidents, labeling them as isolated anomalies. But the virus was smarter than anyone anticipated. It mutated to survive, to spread. As reports of unexplained violence increased, authorities scrambled to contain the truth. Despite their efforts, the infection reached the coastlines, spreading through densely populated port cities. Ports, airports, and densely packed towns became epicenters. The infection spread faster than anyone could comprehend. By the time health officials realized the airborne mutation was real, it was too late. The enemy wasn't just among us, it was in the air we breathed. And then there was the Elysium. Anchored in luxury, it was meant to be a retreat for the world's elite. Unbeknownst to its passengers, the yacht took on more than crates of rare wines and exotic goods during its last port stop. Hidden within the cargo hold, something sinister waited. It started with the smell, subtle but unsettling. Crew members noticed it first, a stench that clung to the air near the hold. They joked about it, brushing it off as spoiled goods. But what they dismissed as trivial was far from it. Inside one of those crates, something had begun to stir. The infected cargo, smuggled biological samples, contained traces of the virus. No one on board knew it was there. No one could imagine the horror that would unfold when the containment broke. The first warnings came from whistleblowers, health officials, and scientists who begged authorities to take action. This is not hysteria, they warned. This is a global threat. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. Governments dismissed the reports as fear-mongering. News outlets were silenced. The public was told to carry on as normal, while the infection spread like wildfire through maritime routes. Coast Guard stations reported strange incidents. Fishermen found wandering aimlessly on their boats, their eyes vacant, their skin pale. Cargo ships adrift, their decks splattered with blood but no sign of life aboard. Each report was met with bureaucratic denial and inaction. And as officials delayed, the infection reached places they thought untouchable. By the time they realized their mistake, the Elysium was already sailing into its doom, carrying passengers who would never return. The Coast Guard was our first line of defense, patrolling the seas and responding to any distress. But in recent days, their once reliable transmissions have become sporadic, then silent. Reports began trickling in. Ships found adrift with no signs of life, their decks stained with blood and signs of violent struggles. Eyewitness accounts describe crew members behaving abnormally, eyes vacant, skin pale, attacking without provocation. These weren't isolated incidents. They were multiplying. Station after station reported crazed behavior before abruptly going dark. No one knows why. Were they overrun? Did they abandon their posts? Or did they fall to the same unknown horror spreading across the seas? The tension grows as the voice drops to a near whisper. Whatever the reason, the silence from the Coast Guard leaves one undeniable truth. There is no one out there to help. The oceans, once symbols of freedom, have become a breeding ground for terror. And then there's the Elysium, a yacht that epitomized luxury and exclusivity. Its passengers, celebrities, business moguls, influencers, are accustomed to privilege, shielded from the realities of the outside world. For them, this voyage was an escape, a retreat to indulgence. But privilege offers no protection from what lurks below deck. In the grand ballroom, laughter echoes as drinks flow freely. An influencer live streams the event, oblivious to the faint, ominous creaks beneath their feet. On the deck, a tech mogul boasts about their latest venture, unaware of the subtle stench wafting from the lower levels. Nearby, the captain stands with a wary expression, aware of an unshakable sense of unease but hesitant to voice his concerns. The crew, trained professionals, exchange uneasy glances as they hear faint shuffling sounds from the cargo hold. They've been ordered not to investigate. After all, the rich and powerful mustn't be disturbed, but every second they delay brings the inevitable closer. And amid the opulence and denial is someone who doesn't belong. A journalist, a stowaway who snuck aboard, not for luxury, but for the truth. They've been hiding in the shadows, watching and listening, piecing together the threads of a story no one else wants to tell. When the outbreak begins, they emerge, not to save themselves, but to record the chaos. They shout warnings to the crowd, but their words are drowned out by screams. Their camera captures it all. The bloodied crew member collapsing, the first infected appearing at the edge of the ballroom, and the panicked faces of those who thought they were untouchable. They broadcast a desperate message to the world. "This isn't a freak accident," they cry. "It was inevitable." But as they record the horror, one thing becomes clear. The infection doesn't care about the truth. It only spreads. The opulent serenity aboard the Elysium shattered in an instant. The grand ballroom, once filled with laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses, descended into chaos as the first figure emerged from the shadows of the cargo hold. At first, it seemed like a drunken crew member, stumbling, unsteady, out of place. But then, the truth became horrifyingly clear. Their eyes, bloodshot and lifeless, locked onto the crowd with a hunger that defied human nature. A guttural snarl erupted from their throat as they lunged forward, sinking their teeth into the nearest victim. Panic erupted. Guests screamed and scrambled, overturning tables and trampling one another in their desperate attempt to flee. But the nightmare was far from over. From the depths of the cargo hold, more figures emerged, disfigured, ravenous, and unstoppable. Their growls echoed through the corridors as they tore through the once luxurious yacht, turning it into a blood-soaked battlefield. What was once paradise on water had become a floating tomb. The infected moved with terrifying speed, their inhuman strength no match for the frantic guests. Those who survived the initial onslaught rushed toward the upper decks, clinging to the faint hope of escape. But their ordeal was far from over. With the infected swarming the lower decks, the survivors fled upward, searching for safety. They barricaded doors with whatever they could find. Tables, chairs, even their own luggage. But the relentless pounding of the infected echoed through the halls. A grim reminder that the barriers wouldn't hold forever. The upper deck offered a brief respite, but not the security they so desperately needed. Survivors clung to one another, their fear palpable. A tech mogul, once boasting of his wealth, now sat trembling, whispering prayers under his breath. A young influencer sobbed as she live-streamed her pleas for help, her audience reduced to a few horrified viewers. Safety on the upper decks was an illusion. Supplies were scarce, the infected were relentless, and paranoia began to creep in. Whispers spread among the group, rumors that someone among them was bitten. The fragile unity of the survivors started to crumble. Fear does strange things to people. As the survivors huddled together on the upper deck, their unity fractured. Tensions boiled over as accusations flew and alliances formed. On one side were those who believed in fighting back. arming themselves with makeshift weapons, ready to face the infected head-on. On the other were those consumed by fear, advocating for escape at any cost, even if it meant abandoning others. The yacht's owner, desperate to regain control, attempted to mediate. "We have to work together," he pleaded, but his words fell on deaf ears. A security officer, calm and calculating, took charge of the fighters, rallying them with a steely resolve. Meanwhile, a group of panicked guests began preparing the lifeboats, convinced their only hope lay in the open sea. Amid the chaos, a lone voice tried to reason with them. The stowaway journalist, now exposed, urged everyone to consider the bigger picture. "The infection spreads fast," they warned. "If we don't act carefully, it will follow us wherever we go." But their warnings were drowned out by shouting, fear outweighing logic. The infected grew closer, their snarls echoing louder. The survivors had a choice: fight for their lives together or succumb to their fear and divide. Neither option offered guarantees, but time was running out. In the face of overwhelming fear, a few brave individuals stepped forward. While most of the survivors remained paralyzed by terror or divided by distrust, a small group banded together, determined to find a way out of the nightmare. The yacht's head of security, a former Marine named Cole, took charge. His calm demeanor and decisive actions rallied those willing to fight. Alongside him stood the yacht's owner, visibly shaken but resolved to fix what he could, and the stowaway journalist, who insisted their knowledge of the virus might provide an edge. With makeshift weapons, table legs, kitchen knives, and fire extinguishers, they scoured the upper deck for resources, forming a plan. The infected were relentless, pounding against barricades, their growls a constant reminder that time was slipping away. This small alliance became a beacon of hope for the others, but their task was monumental: to restore power to the yacht, secure supplies, and find a way to survive. And they knew one thing for certain: staying divided would mean death. For many survivors, the lifeboats represented salvation, a chance to escape the infected swarm and the death trap of the Elysium. But hope can be as deceptive as it is fleeting. As the group approached the lifeboats, the first obstacle became clear. Lowering the boats required power, and the yacht's systems were still offline. Cole and the others worked frantically, trying to override the manual locks while the infected grew louder, their relentless pounding reverberating through the steel walls. But even as they struggled, another horror revealed itself. In the surrounding waters, dark shapes bobbed near the surface. The infected, former passengers who had been thrown overboard, were not as lifeless as they seemed. Their disfigured faces broke the surface, their dead eyes fixating on the survivors. Cole pulled the group back, shouting, "If we get in those boats, they'll swarm us. We need another way." Panic spread among the survivors as their last hope of escape dissolved. The infected below and the ones in the water left them trapped, their options narrowing by the second. With the lifeboats compromised, the group turned to a single desperate solution: restoring the ship's power. The yacht's engine room, deep within the infected lower decks, was their only chance to regain control and call for help. But reaching it would be a deadly gamble. The infected swarmed the hallways, their snarls echoing through the ship. Navigating the maze of corridors required speed, stealth, and nerves of steel. Cole volunteered to lead the charge, knowing full well the danger. The yacht's owner, guilt-ridden over the unfolding chaos, insisted on joining him. "This is my ship," he said. "I'll fix this." Armed with only flashlights and makeshift weapons, the small team descended into darkness. Each step brought them closer to the engine room, and the nest of infected multiplying within. The stench of decay grew unbearable, the air thick with the virus that had consumed so many lives. Every corner they turned felt like a trap. Every shadow held the promise of death, and yet they pressed on, knowing that without power, the yacht and everyone aboard was doomed. As the infected pounded relentlessly on the barricades, the survivors were faced with an impossible decision: stay and fight or risk everything to restore power and escape. With the yacht in chaos and the infected closing in, they divided into two groups, each shouldering a dangerous task. On the upper deck, Cole and a handful of determined survivors fortified their position. Armed with makeshift weapons, they braced themselves for the onslaught. "Hold the line," Cole barked, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. Every creak of the barricade, every distant growl was a reminder of what they were up against. Meanwhile, a smaller team ventured into the bowels of the ship, their mission to reach the engine room and restore power. Leading them was the yacht's owner, whose guilt drove him forward. The stowaway journalist followed closely, documenting every moment, while another survivor carried a toolkit, their trembling hands clutching a flashlight. With each step into the darkened corridors, the air grew heavier, the stench of death unbearable. The infected moved like shadows, their guttural snarls echoing around every corner. And yet, the group pressed on, knowing that failure would doom them all. Two groups, two missions, but neither could afford to fail. The infected weren't just relentless, they were evolving, growing faster, more dangerous. Time was running out as the team reached the lower levels. Their flashlights illuminated scenes straight from a nightmare. The corridors were splattered with blood, handprints smeared across walls, and discarded belongings scattered like the remnants of lives abruptly ended. Then they found it, the engine room. But what they saw inside froze them in their tracks. The infected weren't just lurking, they were multiplying. A writhing mass of bodies, some fully turned, others halfway between human and monster, filled the room. Their milky eyes glinted in the dim light as they turned, one by one, toward the intruders. The infected surged forward as the team fought to hold them back. The yacht's owner shouted, "Cover me!" as he dove toward the control panel, frantically trying to restore power. The stowaway swung a wrench, their breaths ragged as they fought to keep the creatures at bay. Every second felt like an eternity. In the chaos, one of the team members was grabbed, their screams echoing through the metal walls. But there was no time to mourn. With a final desperate push, the yacht's systems roared to life, the hum of power cutting through the chaos. Lights flickered on and the infected recoiled, momentarily stunned. But the victory was hollow. The nest wasn't destroyed, only disturbed. And now, with the ship's power restored, the infected were more agitated than ever, their fury directed squarely at the survivors. Amid the chaos of the infected swarming the yacht, a revelation shattered what little hope the survivors had left. In the flickering light of the restored power, the yacht's owner, Harold Langston, stood trembling, his face pale with guilt. He looked at the survivors around him and finally broke his silence. "This is my fault," Langston confessed, his voice cracking. "The cargo we took on, it wasn't inspected." He hesitated, his words weighted with regret. I was paid to transport biological materials. I didn't ask questions. It was just another business deal." The group stared at him in disbelief. "You mean to tell us," the stowaway journalist snapped, "that you brought this virus on board?" Langston's silence was answer enough. The infection, the horror unfolding around them, had been smuggled aboard with the same callous disregard that fueled his fortune. Accusations flew. Survivors called Langston a murderer, a monster, but there was no time for justice. The infected were closing in, and every second wasted brought death closer. Langston, guilt-ridden and desperate to atone, swore to help in any way he could. Whether the group would trust him was another matter entirely. In the midst of the chaos, the stowaway journalist made a decision. They couldn't let Langston's confession go unheard. They couldn't let the world remain blind to the truth. While the others prepared to defend the yacht, the journalists climbed to the highest point of the ship, setting up their camera and microphone. "If you're watching this," they began, their voice trembling but resolute, "you need to know the truth. This outbreak, this horror, it didn't happen by chance. Greed brought it here. The cargo aboard the Elysium, wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. And now it's out of control. As the journalists transmitted their message, the infected climbed closer. Their growls grew louder. But the journalists didn't stop. "Avoid the seas," they urged. "Trust no one." Their final words echoed into the void as the infected swarmed them, silencing their voice but not their message. The broadcast reached the outside world, a chilling warning of what was to come. But for those still aboard, there was no time to grieve. The storm was only beginning. As the survivors regrouped, the skies above the yacht darkened. A violent storm rolled in, waves crashing against the hull, with a force that threatened to tear the vessel apart. Lightning lit up the night, each flash revealing the infected swarming the yacht's exterior, their pale, bloodied faces pressed against the windows. The barricades were no longer enough. With the storm howling and the infected climbing the yacht's sides, the survivors were trapped between two relentless forces. Rain poured through broken windows, flooding the lower decks, as the infected began breaking through to the upper levels. In the chaos, Langston tried to redeem himself, rallying the group to focus on survival. "If we can hold them off until the storm passes, we might have a chance," he shouted over the thunder. Cole, ever the leader, organized the survivors into defensive positions, while others scrambled to find flares or anything that could signal for help. Lightning struck the yacht's mast, the blinding flash momentarily stunning the infected, but the survivors knew it wouldn't last. As the infected began scaling the sides, again, one thing became clear. The storm wasn't their enemy, it was their only hope of survival. If they could outlast it, they might live to see another day. If not, the infected would claim them all. And so, with the storm raging and the infected closing in, the survivors braced for the fight of their lives. The ocean had never felt so vast, and hope had never seemed so far away. In the heart of the chaos, a faint glimmer of hope appeared. The survivors had one chance: restart the yacht's engines and regain control. Deep within the ship, Cole and Langston worked feverishly at the control panel, their hands shaking as the infected clawed at the metal walls outside the engine room. At last, with a deafening roar, the engine sputtered to life. The sound reverberated through the ship, a beacon of hope for the survivors clinging to life on the upper decks. Cheers broke out among the group, but their relief was short-lived. The hum of the engines wasn't just a sign of survival, it was a call to the infected. The infected in the lower decks went into a frenzy, their snarls and howls intensifying. But that wasn't the worst of it. Outside, the sound of the engines carried across the water, drawing the infected floating in the surrounding waves. They began to converge on the yacht, their pale, bloated forms thrashing toward the hull. On the deck, survivors shouted warnings as the infected began climbing the sides of the ship, their fingers clawing into crevices, their hunger driving them upward. Cole and Langston fought their way back to the group, but the swarm was relentless. Every moment the engines ran brought more infected, threatening to overwhelm what little defenses remained. The engines brought a spark of hope, but they also unleashed a tidal wave of terror. The survivors had to act quickly because the infected were no longer just swarming the yacht. They were consuming it. With the storm raging and the infected closing in, the survivors found themselves cornered. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the relentless horde climbing the ship's sides. Rain poured in sheets, soaking everyone to the bone and making the deck treacherously slick. Cole rallied the survivors, shouting orders over the howling wind. "We have to hold them off! Use anything you can!" Broken furniture, fire extinguishers, and even shards of glass became weapons in the desperate fight for survival. Every swing, every shove was a battle against exhaustion and fear. Amid the chaos, Langston stood apart, his guilt weighing on him like a physical burden. He watched as people fought for their lives, knowing it was his choices that had brought them to this point. Finally, he turned to Cole. "I can buy you some time," he said quietly. "You need it more than I do." As Langston ran toward the swarm, the survivors barely had time to process his sacrifice. They fought harder, driven by his final act of redemption. But the storm showed no mercy, and neither did the infected. Every second felt like an eternity, the odds stacked impossibly high against them. With nature and the undead combining forces, survival seemed almost impossible. Yet, the survivors clung to one desperate hope: to outlast the storm and live to see the sunrise. But would the dawn bring salvation or reveal the full scope of their nightmare? As the survivors piled into the lifeboat, it seemed as if salvation was finally within reach. The engines of the yacht groaned under the weight of the storm, and the infected swarmed the decks above, their guttural growls fading into the distance as the lifeboat began to drift away. But what felt like relief was fleeting. Beneath the surface, a darker truth lurked. Trust is fragile in moments of desperation. And when one survivor noticed a passenger clutching their arm, a trickle of blood seeping from a hastily wrapped bandage, everything unraveled. "What happened to you?" the young influencer demanded, her voice rising above the crashing waves. The man, a crew member who had fought valiantly to protect others, hesitated. His eyes darted to the others, panic etched across his face. "It's nothing," he stammered. "I cut myself on the railing." But no one believed him. Suspicion spread like wildfire, igniting arguments and shoving matches. "You're infected," someone shouted, and chaos erupted. In the cramped confines of the lifeboat, fear turned to fury. The crew member pleaded, swearing he wasn't bitten, but the group's paranoia had taken hold. In their desperation to survive, they made a harrowing decision. They forced him overboard, ignoring his cries as the storm swallowed him whole. But even as the lifeboat drifted farther from the yacht, the survivors couldn't shake the shadow of their actions. Trust was gone, replaced by a silence thicker than the storm clouds above. And in the distance, the infected still howled, a reminder that the nightmare was far from over. The lifeboat was battered by the relentless storm, the infected closing in from all sides. Waves tossed the small vessel, and every flash of lightning revealed the pale, distorted faces of the undead swimming toward them. Panic rose as the survivors realized they were running out of time and options. It was Cole, the remaining security officer, who broke the silence. "They're not going to stop," he said, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Someone has to draw them away." The group fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking in. "No," the yacht's owner protested. "We can fight them off together." But Cole shook his head. "If we stay together, we all die." With a grim resolve, Cole stood and began removing his gear. "Get to the shore, Ray," he said firmly. "Find help. Make this mean something." Before anyone could stop him, he leapt into the churning water, shouting and splashing to draw the infected toward him. His sacrifice was immediate. The infected swarmed him, their howls deafening as the storm raged on. The lifeboat drifted farther, the survivors watching in stunned silence as Cole disappeared beneath the waves. His sacrifice bought them precious time, but it came at a terrible cost. They had lost their protector, their leader, and the one person who had kept them united. As dawn broke, the survivors could see land in the distance, a thin line on the horizon, their last hope of survival. But Cole's final words echoed in their minds. Survival came with a price, and their journey was far from over. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, the survivors sat huddled in the lifeboat, battered and silent. The storm had passed, leaving an eerie calm in its wake. The infected were nowhere to be seen, but their presence lingered, etched into the minds of those who had escaped. Their eyes turned back toward the Elysium, now a ghost ship adrift in the open sea. Smoke billowed from its decks, its once luxurious halls now overrun with the infected. It was no longer a symbol of wealth and power, but a floating tomb, carrying the echoes of screams and the horrors that had unfolded aboard. And then a distant sound, a rhythmic thrum, faint at first but growing louder. The survivors looked up, shielding their eyes from the rising sun. A helicopter, its silhouette cutting through the morning haze, approached from the horizon. Relief washed over the group, but it was tempered with caution. Would this be their salvation? Or had the infection already reached the outside world? The lifeboat's flare gun was fired, the red streak arching into the sky. The helicopter changed course, heading toward them. But as it drew closer, the survivors saw something chilling. A figure leaned from the side of the chopper, waving, but their skin was pale, their eyes vacant. The infection had spread farther than they had imagined. Hope hung in the air, fragile and fleeting. The survivors could only wait, caught between salvation and despair, as the infected continued their relentless march across the seas. It was a broadcast like no other, a chilling message that cut through the noise of the world. Emergency frequencies across the globe carried the same haunting warning. This is a public safety alert. Avoid all maritime zones. Trust no vessel, no survivor. The warning detailed the spread of the infection, originating from ports and vessels carrying the virus. Coastlines became the front line of an invisible war as the infected swarmed from the sea to the land. Panic spread as governments declared quarantine zones, sealing off entire regions in a desperate bid to contain the outbreak. This is not an isolated incident, the broadcast continued. The infection is spreading globally. All citizens are advised to stay inland and avoid contact with individuals displaying symptoms. But for many, the warning came too late. Fishing villages, coastal towns, even bustling metropolises, none were spared the wrath of the infected. The broadcast reached billions, a grim testament to the scale of the catastrophe. And yet, for those still stranded at sea, the message offered no solace. For them, there was no escape. Only the hope that someone, somewhere, would heed the warning and fight back. The camera pans outward, revealing the grim truth in full. Coastal cities lie in ruins, their streets overrun with the infected. Smoke rises from burning buildings, and the once bustling harbors are silent, save for the faint growls of those left behind. Fishing boats drift aimlessly, their crews either lost or worse. Cargo ships, symbols of commerce and connection, now serve as vessels of death, carrying the infection to shores far and wide. The ocean, once a place of adventure and freedom, has become a highway for horror. And as the camera pulls back farther, the scale of the devastation becomes clear. The infection isn't contained, it's spreading. Relentless and unstoppable. The coastline is no longer a place of refuge, but a battleground, foreshadowing a grim future for humanity. This is not the end of the story. It's only the beginning. The infected are no longer confined to the sea. They're here and they're everywhere. If you've listened to this radio broadcast all the way to the end, thank you for joining us. Your support means everything to us. To help us continue bringing you immersive and engaging broadcasts like this on a daily basis, consider joining our channel by clicking on the Join button. Stay connected with us for daily video updates and be part of our growing community by subscribing to our channel. If you have any suggestions or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comment box below. And if you enjoyed this broadcast, please don't forget to like and share this video. Your support helps us reach more listeners and keeps us motivated to bring you the best content every day. Stay safe, stay informed, and until next time, thank you for being with us.